Welcome to Discovering the Law. My name is Lucy Rivera, and I am your host for today. This episode can be viewed at www.discoveringthelaw.com. Today, we have a very special guest. We have retired judge and author, Honorable Marc Kantrowitz. And we are here today to talk about his book, All Whiskey and Young Women. Your Honor, your book is on TV on display now.
Oh, very good.
And we just wanted to ask you, Your Honor, what prompted you to write this book?
Well, I love history, and
It's still on TV, though.
Oh, it's not.
Are we on now? Okay.
Well, I love history, and I write a column for Lawyers Weekly. Comes out once a month. It's called Law and History, and it's this is basically an expanded version of my column.
And what's the content of your book? What is your book about?
My book is about once famous and now forgotten criminal cases, and when the cases occurred, they gripped the nation, and now they're probably totally forgotten through the passage of time.
And Your Honor, why don't you tell us so how many cases do you think you talk about in your book?
I talk about 30 separate cases, and they start in the 1780s, and the last cases, it's around 1970 or so.
And how did you pick this time frame to write about these cases?
It just, wherever the case fell, I just happened to write about it, and there was no specific reason why I didn't write about anything earlier or anything later, but the cases just fell where they fell.
And that's fascinating, but what is the particular reason that you picked these cases collected in your book?
Well, I went through a whole bunch of cases, and I picked like what I like to think are the 30 most interesting cases, and as I said, they all gripped America. When they happened, America was fascinated with the case. It was front page news. If they had television at the time, it would have been the lead story, and it would have been the lead story for many days. Now, through the passage of time, it's totally forgotten.
Well, why don't you talk to us about one of these 30 cases? And
one
for
of the
example,
30 cases.
we can discuss
okay.
one of them and find out why. How is it that it ripped the nation?
Okay. Well, Ed Gein. Have you ever heard of Ed Gein?
No, I can't say.
You know, I lecture fairly extensively, and I ask that question, and typically everybody says no, except if they're from Wisconsin, because that's where the crimes occurred. And this was in the mid-50s, and Ed Gein he was a very nondescript fellow. He was kind of short, very common-looking fellow. He had a droopy eye. Kids used to make fun of him in school, and he was very closely attached to his mother, who thought that all women were vile. All men were lustful. Everybody was evil. So they wound up living. There were 4 members of the family: the husband and Ed's brother shortly died. So Ed was living in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin, Plainfield, Wisconsin, on a farm. In the 50s, no electricity, no inside plumbing, and Ed's mother died, and Ed was now living by himself. And Ed loved his mother, was very dedicated to his mother. And then before you know it, one day, the day before hunting season, Ed comes into town and says, he goes to Warren's store and says, where's everybody gonna be tomorrow? And they said, they're gonna be out hunting. So Ed said, oh, that's nice. So the next day, Ed returns to the store. No one's there but poor Mrs. Warden, and we never see Mrs. Warden again. 2 years earlier, Mary Hogan, who was a bartender, right? She tended bar in this small, nondescript bar, and she disappeared. So when Mrs. Warden's son comes back from deer hunting that night, he goes to the store, his mother's not there, and he's wondering, where's my mother? And he remembers Ed Gein was asking, so maybe we should go out to his house and look. So he calls the police, and the police go out. They don't find him. They go to a neighbor's house.
Yeah.
They start talking to him, and pretty soon he incriminates himself. They go back to Ed's house. Now imagine, if you will, it's a cold November evening, right? There's no lights, and there's no electricity. So the police go inside to the house, and they're looking around. They have a dim flashlight, and they're looking around, and there's garbage all over the place. It was like Hoarders. If you ever watch a TV show, Hoarders, that's what it looked like.
Oh, my goodness.
So there's all this garbage, and he happened to brush up against something that kind of swung. He glanced, and he thought it was a deer. He thought it was a deer hanging, and then when he put his flashlight on it, it was Mrs. Warden. So, who looked like a gutted deer. So they looked around the house. They found one head of, on the bedpost, the head of Mrs. Hogan, the head of Mrs. Warden. They found all sorts of body parts all over. So a local journalist said, I'm going to write a story about this, but I'm going to change the name, and I'm going to change the name from Ed Gein to Norman Bates, and I'm going to name my story Psycho. And Alfred Hitchcock purchased the rights to the book, and it is now a classic American film. So Ed Gein is in effect the real Norman Bates. And let me tell you, he's a lot worse than than Norman Bates was. He was a horrendous type of situation. A little too gruesome. We won't talk about it here, but it is in the book.
Real life is just probably a lot more interesting than fiction.
It is.
But now this story of Ed Gein happened in 1950s, as you mentioned.
Right, in the 50s.
Why is it that a man before, you didn't mention that he did any of this while he was living with his mother, but suddenly now he went on a rampage, and as soon as the mother died, what can you comment to us about this individual?
Well, he probably had you couldn't do it because, mom was living there. He might have been doing some of this. He would either kill someone, or he would go to a cemetery and dig up their body and chop up the body. He had a mother suit, which was made of all parts, kind of like Silence of the Lambs, all parts of his victims. And he had you want me to talk about the gruesome stuff. I said I wasn't going to talk about it. So, cut up body parts in shoe boxes. It was awful.
This is definitely fascinating.
It is
your
fascinating.
book is absolutely interesting, talking about all these different criminal stories.
Right.
I don't want to give it away, but tell us a little bit about the process of writing criminal story. I mean, compiling this. How long did it take you to write this book?
It took me about 3 years to write the book, and like anything, you start researching one case, and while you're researching one case, they'll say, oh, this is similar to another case. So you have two cases for the price of one. So, and research was fairly easy. There have been books and even movies. Psycho, for instance, was a movie that was made. Obviously, it's fictionalized. People don't know that's really Ed Gein.
Oh, interesting.
But it is, yeah.
Now, why did you write this book, specifically about the stories?
The reason I write my column is that, someone once came up to me after reading my column, and she said, Mark, I hated history in school, but I love your column. And I think that's because sometimes history is kind of taught very blandly, perhaps. The his taken out of history, the human taken out of humanity. And I wanted to humanize history. I wanted to put people, historical figures, in perspective and make them human, make them normal. And my column's been is pretty popular. My book is selling pretty well, so I think people they like that.
So in that vein, about famous cases, what about famous cases today? Do you plan to write a book about famous cases today?
In 50 years, right? So I like sticking with history. And what's the most famous case? The most modern trial of the century. It's probably O.J. Simpson. In fact, there's a TV series now about O.J. Simpson. And I could tell you with great certainty that in 100 years, no one will know about O.J. Simpson, and no one will know about the case. He'll be totally forgotten. And if you want to say, how do you know that? Because Fatty Arbuckle is an example. Fatty Arbuckle was America's foremost comedian 100 years ago. About 100, he and Charlie Chaplin were the foremost comedians in America at the time. And today, Fatty Arbuckle is totally forgotten. And he was involved in the greatest, at the time, criminal case in America. It was the rape murder of Virginia Rapp. She changed her name. She was an actress. She changed her name to Rappe because she thought it sounded better. And Fatty was accused, falsely accused, mind you, of her rape and her murder. Today, it was the biggest case at the time. Today, it's totally forgotten.
And where is that? What's the era or the year?
That was in late. It was his trial was the early 1920s. The event like late 19 teens. So just 100 years ago. It was the O.J. Simpson case at the time, but it's totally forgotten today.
And what are your sources? How do you find this cases? How do you say, oh, this case in 1950 or the 1920s in particular? If you weren't really there in the 20s.
I wasn't there
and
at the 20s.
And I'm sure you weren't there in the 50s.
No. So, as I was doing my research, it's all online. There are movies about it, and Fatty Arbuckle he was America's foremost comedian. So, it just kind of fell into my lap, and I did a little research about it, and
periodicals and
books and periodicals. And I can give you another example of how I found the case, and you'll like this being a lawyer. Mapp versus Ohio, right? It's the seminal,
constitutional
very
case.
good. Very good. It was a constitutional criminal case. And the case extended search and seizure and exclusionary rule to the states. So as you know, somewhere in America today, right this second as we're talking, someone's getting arrested, evidence is being taken from him, and that person's going to go into court a month or week or 2 months from now and file a motion to suppress evidence.
That's right.
That's all thanks to Dolly Mapp. So I said to myself,
Dolly Mapp.
Dolly Mapp.
Who is Dolly Mapp?
So I'm going to say, I said, that's what I said. I said, who is Dolly Mapp? Dolly Mapp was...
Mapp versus Ohio.
If there was going to be a movie about Dolly Mapp, J-Lo would play Dolly Mapp.
Gracious.
She was very... She was a very attractive woman. She was a somewhat fast woman. She didn't back down from anyone. She had one step on this side of the law and one step on that side of the law. She lived in Cleveland, which, believe it or not, in the 50s and 60s was a very hot city. And there's this fellow, and he was running numbers and everything, but he wasn't paying the higher-ups to send him a message. They blew up his front porch. So he got a little perturbed, as you can imagine. So he calls the police do an investigation, and a few days later they get a phone call. And they said, if you want to find the person who blew up the kid's porch, go to Dolly Mapp's place. So the police go to Dolly Mapp. They say, we have... they knock on the door and they say, we have a warrant. She says, let me see the warrant. They show her a folded up piece of paper. She grabs the paper, she puts it down her dress. They struggle and they wind up getting, they get some incriminating stuff. Nothing to do with the bombing, mind you. And she's subsequently criminally charged with an offense. Goes up to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court comes up with the, search and seizure and the exclusionary rule. The interesting thing was the fellow whose porch had been blown up. He'd already done time for manslaughter. He did like 3 or 4 years for manslaughter. His house is getting blown up. So he said to himself, it's time to leave Cleveland. Boxing was very big in Cleveland at the time. So he said, I'm just gonna go to Vegas. And he went to Vegas, became a boxing promoter. Don King is his name. He's the biggest boxing promoter in America, and that's how he's a footnote to criminal law jurisprudence in history. But Dolly was a very fascinating woman. She'd been married to a boxer. At one time, he hit her. She said, I'm out of here. I'm not putting up with that. Another time, she got engaged to another boxer who broke off the engagement. She winds up suing him for breach of contract. So she's someone who did not step down. She was very, very feisty, very attractive woman, and would make a great movie, right?
Great ideas. I think you need to, we need to call Hollywood now.
I
so
think
you
so.
can be,
Well, you and I.
Thank you, Dolly Map, for giving us Map versus Ohio.
Exactly right.
Your Honor. Also, please let us know, but why don't you comment on maybe cases now that are interesting, that are cases that will be forgotten, other than the O.J. Simpson.
Well, yeah, what are the biggest cases today? When I teach.
Local cases.
Yeah, but it's what are the O.J. Simpson case is the biggest case, and that'll be forgotten. As for other cases, your viewers and somebody when I teach, I teach about my book also, and some people will say Casey Anthony. You remember the Casey Anthony case from a few years ago down in Florida?
Right.
My God, that was the biggest case, and now it's almost totally forgotten, and it's only been a few years. So the cases that really, it's the O.J. Simpson cases that we're really involved with here.
And you also mentioned to me earlier Webster and
Bathsheba Spooner is these are my books. My articles take place in Boston, in New York, Hollywood. People of Hollywood, in the Midwest, Chicago, and Wisconsin at Gein story. So there's a few Boston cases, and when I talk in Boston, I'll discuss my Boston cases. And two of the biggest Boston cases, one was the Parkman-Webster murder case, and you being a lawyer, the Webster model jury instruction on reasonable doubt, that came from the Webster case.
That is fascinating. We need to hear about this case.
Okay, so it was 1849, and Professor Webster, kind of a cherubic type of fellow, taught chemistry at Harvard Medical School. At the time, Harvard Medical School, you know where MGH is? You look at MGH, right to the left of MGH, where there's a parking garage now. That was Harvard Medical School at the time. And he was a fellow who liked to live a little above his means. And he had a family, and he spent a little too much money. So having a little too much money, he was always mortgaging stuff and borrowing money. So he borrowed money from Professor Parkman. Professor Parkman was from a very famous family, very wealthy family, studied psychiatry in the 1830s and 40s in Europe.
He sounds brilliant.
He was, but he was very, very odd. They called him the Chin, because a very tall guy who would wear a stovetop hat, and he would, when he would walk, he would put his chin up when he walked, and people called him the Chin and kind of made fun behind his back. But he's very, very wealthy, so he lends Webster some money.
Okay.
And then he finds out later that Webster is trying to mortgage his mineral collection to raise more money, but lo and behold, Webster had already mortgaged his mineral collection to Parkman. So Parkman is incensed. He starts chasing after Webster. Webster says, "Come to my class at Harvard Medical School." This is in November 1849. Professor Parkman goes to see Webster, and lo and behold, we never see Parkman again. So a week later, the crime is solved by Ephraim Littlefield, who's a janitor at Harvard Medical Field. He's kind of snooping around, and he climbs down to the downstairs, and he cuts through some brick, chiseled through the brick to get to Webster's privy bathroom, where he did a terrible job. And he looks in there, and lo and behold, he sees part of Dr. Parkman's body. And then the police come, and they find other parts of Parkman's body here, other part here. They never find his head. So it's a big, big, big case in America. In the world, journalists from Berlin, from London, and from Paris all came to Boston to cover the case, the trial in 1850. Webster was subsequently found guilty, and he was hanged. He didn't have the greatest legal representation, but that's a different story for a different day. But it was the biggest case, literally, in the world. And you can imagine, in 1850, it was kind of difficult to fly from Europe to America. Number one, you couldn't fly; you'd have to take a boat, right? But it really gripped the nation. It gripped the world, gripped Europe when it happened, and now it's totally forgotten.
And I wonder, since he promised this chattel or collateral to two different people, if that gave rise to that perfection and
Oh.
securities law.
We're going to law school
attachments.
now. You know, I don't think it
Who's
gave
going
right. I think they already had that,
Who's going to
frankly.
have that property? Who was the priority?
It's another discussion for another day, and probably a little more boring discussion, the perfection of collateral, right?
That's right. Now, Your Honor, in that vein, on this case that you were talking about, why do you feel that they didn't have proper? Do you feel that this person might have been not guilty since he didn't have the proper defense?
Well, he had a bad. His defense did a bad job.
Okay.
And during the trial, he
And
was.
how was that? Like,
Well, like during the trial, he would write notes because Littlefield would say, "This past Wednesday, I saw Webster somewhere," and Webster would write a note and said, "I wasn't where Littlefield said, and here are the witnesses who can say I wasn't." So he gave these notes to his lawyer, and his lawyer didn't do anything with it. So his lawyer never called those witnesses to impeach the credibility of Ephraim Littlefield. And you can see those notes. They're in the Mass Historical Society.
No
now,
alibi, right? He didn't explore the alibi defense.
Yeah, he would, the obvious defense was Littlefield did it because Littlefield was a procurer of cadavers. He was an expert in chopping up bodies. A head for $10, a body for $25, and it was pretty gruesome back then, the securing of bodies for medical school. And
So this also could be maybe an example of bad law as to why didn't this person pursue the defense of maybe an alibi, or why didn't this lawyer, or this is an example of back then what. Maybe he was innocent. Maybe he was not guilty.
Well, he did.
And how do we know that he didn't?
Well, right when he was being hanged, right before he was being hanged, he said he did it.
Oh, okay,
so
good.
Someone say he.
Really?
However, well, that's another discussion for another day. Because one book, there are two books written about it. Both books came out in 1970, including a book by Robert Sullivan, who was a Superior Court judge, and he seems to think that he did not do it.
Oh, well, Your Honor, we have run out of time.
Oh.
But I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
This book is fascinating.
Thank you.
I think that your work is amazing. Thank you for coming today. And for our viewers, thank you so much for watching today. This episode can be viewed at www.discoveringthelaw.com. My name is Lucy Rivera. Please contact us at Discovering the Law. Let us know what you would like to hear. And thank you for watching.